I'm Dr. Sean Wilson. I'm an assistant professor in the Sociology and Criminal Justice Department here at William Patterson University. Just so you all know, this panel is being recorded. So if you don't feel comfortable participating in this panel while it's being recorded, you can feel free to leave. Save all your questions for the Q&A component of tonight's event, which will occur at 8:30. So we'll have a conversation and then we'll open it up to Q&A at 8:30. So save all your questions for the Q&A. And thank you for joining us tonight. Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's conversation on decolonizing the curriculum in academia. I am Dr. Sean Wilson. I'm from the Sociology and Criminal Justice Department here at William Patterson University. I am happy to have all of you here with us for this important conversation. Decolonization in academia seeks to shift institutions and classroom experiences by foregrounding the knowledges of the oppressed and marginalized. Counter-colonial discourse seeks to assert the humanity, agency, and sovereignty of colonized people. If we seek to decolonize curriculum and practice in higher education, we must all engage in an unthinking and undoing of traditional disciplinary practices. The focus of tonight's conversation is to highlight historical and contemporary decolonial practices that seek to liberate marginalized populations. Decolonization has material consequences. Thus, it is imperative that social justice advocates, scholars, and institutions of higher education engage in true decolonial praxis. All of our panelists tonight engage in authentic decolonial praxis in their own unique ways that is shaped by their lived experiences and their commitment to racial justice. They all are fierce advocates for social justice, and they ground their scholarship, service, and advocacy in transformative and decolonial praxis. It truly is an honor to have these esteemed panelists join us tonight for this important conversation. So thank you all for agreeing to participate in this conversation. Our first panelist is Dr. Chanel Jones. Dr. Jones is the Assistant Dean of Community Engagement and Chair of the Public Safety Programs at Franklin University. She also oversees the Center for Public Safety and Cybersecurity Education and the Global Center for Healthcare Education at Franklin University. Dr. Jones received her PhD in Administration of Justice from Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas. Her research interests include race and crime, policing, and juvenile delinquency. She's particularly interested in issues of police, community relations, disproportionate minority contact, mass incarceration, and the intersection of race and gender in the criminal justice system. Dr. Jones currently serves as the National Director of Research for the Teen and Police Service Academy, TAPS, a federally funded program designed to reduce social distance between police officers and youth. As a director, she's responsible for establishing the research agenda, analyzing data, and serving as a consultant for best practices in improving relations between teens and the police. She has written numerous articles and book chapters on public perceptions of the police, race, and administration of justice. She is also the co-editor of a critical analysis of race and administration of justice. Dr. Jones is a highly sought after speaker and has conducted several presentations, keynotes, and media appearances on issues of race, police community relations, and disproportionate minority contact. She's a reviewer for the US Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs, the National Institute of Justice, and several academic journals, including the Journal of Juvenile Justice, the Journal of Offender Rehabilitation, and Race and Justice. She is a crime analyst for TV One's hit show, for my man. She was appointed by Columbus Mayor Andrew Ginther to serve on the Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission. She is a member of the Juvenile Detention Facility Assessment Team for Franklin County. She is an ambassador for the Ohio Office of Criminal Justice Services Change Starts Here campaign. She is featured in an unfinished documentary, Change Starts With You, which highlights law enforcement and community-wide efforts to improve police-community relations. Dr. Jones founded Come Together Columbus, which is a loose collective of organizations and individuals committed to racial justice, community empowerment, and police reform in Columbus, Ohio. Dr. Jones is also the recipient of numerous awards, including Franklin University's Dean Award, Recognizing Excellence, Franklin University's Core Value Award for Respect, the Central Ohio Social Justice Award for Education, Advocacy, and Higher Education, Columbus CEO's Future 50 Award, Columbus Business First 40 Under 40 Award, the Conley Award for Excellence in Teaching, the Sankofa Award for Education, and the Visionary Award by Columbus City Council and the Create Columbus Commission. Dr. Jones is the 2018 recipient of the Emerald Literati Award for Most Outstanding Author Contribution for her book chapter, The New Jane Crow, Mass Incarceration, and the Denied Maternity of Black Women. She serves on the board of the Grant Foundation by Grant Medical Center, the Columbus Impact and Inclusion Advisory Board for Columbus Young Professionals, and the Advisory Board for the Black Legacy Advancement Coalition, which is a national policy think tank organization established to advance and defend African-American interests for life and legacy. Dr. Jones is also a member of several community and professional organizations, including Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, the Create Columbus Commission, the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, the American Society of Criminology, the National Associations of Blacks in Criminal Justice, and the Racial Democracy and Criminal Justice Network. Welcome, Dr. Jones.
Thank you. It's glad to be here. I didn't realize you were going to read the whole thing. I just want to put that out there.
Well, I think we need to recognize your amazing and immense contribution. So I felt I had to do it. I'm sorry.
No worries. Thank you. I'm glad to be a part of this panel.
Thank you for joining us. Our next panelist is Dr. Zoe Spencer. Dr. Zoe Spencer, or Dr. Z, as she is affectionately referred, is a scholar activist and civil rights strategist, CEO of Diverse Relations Group, LLC, and a professor of sociology from Berry Farms Projects in Southeast DC. She received her PhD, MSW, and BA from the Mecca, Howard University. She is a highly sought after presenter and lecturer with hundreds of presentations to her credit, a civil and human rights strategist, a race work consultant, and well-published author, whose latest works on post-traumatic slave master syndrome and Black women's resistance have been published in prestigious peer-reviewed journals with prestigious publishing companies. As a staunch freedom fighter, equity and liberation seeker, she has unapologetically dedicated her life to addressing all issues of oppression and disparity, no matter what form they take, no matter the construct. In such, she has not confined her work to the halls of academia and professional and academic spaces. Instead, she has advocated for victims of state-sponsored violence, organized direct actions, and committed to serving as a constant speaker, presenter, educator, and consultant on race relations in all forms, from men's level 2, 3, and 4 correctional facilities to professional and academic conferences, where she has answered the calls to address the roots of global oppression, as well as defending others who resist. But most importantly, to her divine purpose, she is ma to her son, a grandmother to her future freedom fighter, Isla 7th Kemet, an auntie to her beautiful, brilliant HBCU students, a nagging thorn to the power structure, and a woman warrior comrade to the queens and sisters who stand on the front lines in the battles against all forms of oppression, brutality, and all calls for true and tangible equality, and liberation. Thank you for joining us tonight, Dr. Z. Our next panelist is Dr. Viviane Sayla Hanna, who is a professor and chairperson of Crime and Justice Studies and an affiliate of Women and Gender Studies and Black Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. She serves on the board of the Journal of Prisons on Prisons, the African Journal for Criminology and Justice Studies, and Decolonizing of Criminology and Justice. Her publications have introduced and developed Black feminist hauntology, penal abolition theories, penal colonialism, transformative justice, structurally abusive relationships, and freedom dreams inspired by Octavia Butler and Toni Morrison. Welcome, Doc. It's an honor to have you. Our next panelist is Dr. Matt Matera. Matt Matera is a first-generation college graduate, born and raised here in the great state of New Jersey. He is an educator, organizer, activist, and scholar committed to fighting for social justice and dismantling white supremacy. In 2005, Matt's scholarship and praxis became focused on addressing the injustices that exist at the intersection of education and immigration. He spent the last 15 years creating new ways to make education accessible to students with undocumented immigration status by working closely with immigrant youth and educator activists to found scholarships A through Z in 2009 and the University of Arizona's Immigrant Student Resource Center in 2016. These co-created spaces center the voices of those who are directly impacted by immigration policies and helped over 2,500 youth and students with undocumented or DACA status access scholarships, college, and legal support. Matt holds a PhD and a Master's of Arts in Higher Education from the University of Arizona and a Bachelor of Arts in History from the College of William and Mary. Thank you, Dr. Matera. And thank you, all you amazing panelists for joining us tonight for this important conversation. So we'll start it out with my first question for the panelists. What does decolonizing the curriculum mean to you?
Were you going to go ahead?
Whoever wants to go first.
Dr. Z, were you going to say something?
No, I'll go ahead and defer to you. Yeah, I'll defer and then I'll come in after you.
I mean, my first comment was going to be inspired by something that Dr. Wilson, whose bio should have been read, I want to say, because Dr. Wilson is brilliant, but it was inspired by something you said in your introduction, actually. You had talked about disciplinary practices, and right away it had me thinking about this notion of being disciplined and what discipline looks like through the lens of colonization. And so if the academy implicitly is defined through disciplines, then immediately from jump, it is colonized. And so if we think about how the academy even organizes itself in very segregated places, and the fact that we have to now articulate and try to create interdisciplinary work comes out of the notions of intersectionality and the fact that particularly Black women don't exist in any siloed spaces. And so right away, even through your introduction, it has me rethinking the very organization of the academy. And if that's how we create knowledge, then the way that we treat people within that space is going to be quite violent.
And were you done, Doc? Because that was a pivotal segue for me. In the beginning, I asked Dr. Wilson not to read my bio, and I've asked my colleagues to not call me doctor. And when you talk about decolonization, the term decolonization in academia, be it decolonizing the space, decolonizing the knowledge, decolonizing the literature, I think the first thing that is important and what that means is recognizing that we are not the owners of knowledge, right? And also being able to pay homage to the various sources that we gain our knowledge from, and being able to accept without status, because if we really want to dig down into the root of decolonization, the fact that I have to, or that we would have to qualify ourselves and our credentials and our experience to be in this space to talk about decolonizing the curriculum is colonization within itself. It centers knowledge, it centers experience, it centers analysis within the context of this formalized colonial institution that we call academia. And I think that for me, my resistance to that is being able to resist the labels, being able to resist the box that we are often placed under and how we do research, and being able to resist the notions of what constitutes valuable information, what constitutes valuable facts, what constitutes valuable experiences, and separating that from the institutions that have traditionally been established to maintain power dynamics in our society.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with what everybody has said. And I would add to it another layer of decolonizing the whole academia and curriculum. I'll just give you all a quick example. Yesterday, I received a request. I'm sure all of you are on ResearchGate, right? I received a request for an article that I had wrote. And so I went in to go look for the article to send it to the person that had requested it, right? And lo and behold, I couldn't find the article. So I went to the actual academic journal that I had published the article in, thinking, oh, let me just go on this website. I should have access to it so I can just pull this article and send it to this poor student who was trying to find the article. Lo and behold, they were like, oh, you can get the abstract for free, but if you want the whole article, you're gonna have to pay something like $30-something for an article that I wrote. And so I was like, wait a minute here. If we're going to talk about decolonizing academia, that also means making sure the knowledge that we're all talking about is easily accessible to everybody, because what is the purpose of going along this institutional process when the knowledge is only protected and admissible to all of us who are technically in this club, right? And so I was just beside myself that it was an article and I had to buy the darn article, and I wrote the article. And so I think when we talk about decolonizing academia, that means not just looking at the curriculum and how things are structured, but also what is easily accessible to students, how we are setting students up for a success in our curriculum, centering their experiences, because there is something to be said about experience that sometimes a classroom teaching cannot tell anybody. And so I think all of this combined and collectively brought together is how we can decolonize academia and curriculum. So that was my soapbox from yesterday, y'all. I'm sorry.
I mean, that's a great point. And I think it highlights the importance of us always being self-reflective. And in many instances, some of us may need to decolonize ourselves, right? So if you think about academia and what it takes to get tenure, what it takes to get promotions, it oftentimes involves us having to submit our research to those journals that aren't readily available to the general public. And so we need to consider, is that something that we care more about? Publishing, the mantra of publish or perish, or are we really committed to making sure that the public, right, has access to our knowledge, like Dr. Jones mentioned? And so I think it's something we all need to think about. But great point.
I would just add, so I appreciate the chance to be with you all, and an honor to be here. And again, I'm Matt Matera. I use he, him, his pronouns. What I would add first is that I want to just acknowledge the land that I'm presenting from. So I'm residing and presenting tonight from the traditional territory of the Tohono O'odham people. I think that's an important practice that we do. I think we always need to do more than land acknowledgement, because we still have stolen the land on which our institutions are built on. And so there's that piece that we always need to be recognizing. I think my work is less in the kind of academic and publishing and tenure battles, and more just in the practice and in the student affairs realm and that day-to-day work. So the way I see the kind of decolonization of any type of curriculum, it's really centering a few different things than we are taught to do, and how white supremacy teaches us to do, or whiteness teaches us to do, which is we need to really focus from a place of love, focus from a place that deals with self-work and our own actual healing in what we do, something that I personally struggle with, but know that that's the battle. Because if I enter into trying to organize spaces with students that are going to shift an institution of higher education, if we all enter in from very broken places and we don't talk about or create space for that healing, then eventually that brokenness will take over and we will lose the fight. And so we always need to be centering kind of that self-work and healing. I would also say that, and I guess I'll end on this, the main piece for me in decolonizing any of our work is really ensuring that we are building deeper relationships that are based on self-interest and not really based on this idea that selflessness, right? It's something I've learned over time, that if we enter into spaces and think about that it's not about me, I'm doing this for everybody else, we enter into, for me as a white cisgender man, then we enter into this white saviorism idea, right? But if we come in thinking about how are we connected in our struggle, and figuring out how our fight for liberation is connected, then we can build some deeper relationships and think about what our self-interests are in that, so we can collectively get there, right? And if we do things in an individualistic way, which is often where our institutions push us to be, when things are merit-based, when things that are awarded are those who are doing things on their own. But if we really center this idea of working collectively, then I think we do begin to push in this decolonized way our work forward in higher education and beyond. So I'll pause there. Thanks.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think collaboration is key, especially in hyper individualistic and hyper competitive academia, right? I think it's best to collaborate with people who are doing the work. And so that's something I've always loved to do, is collaborating with amazing scholars and activists who are doing the work. So my next question is, there seems to be a gap between high-level decolonial theory and its practices of implementation. How can we implement decolonial thought and practice in the classroom and in the academy?
No, go ahead, Dr. Jones. Were you getting ready to go? Well, I want to just talk about the gap for a second, because we have to, when Dr. Matera spoke about white supremacy and even the land, like, we have to really, really understand that the current system that we exist in, this kind of global capitalist, hetero, patriarchal, white supremacist system that we exist in, is really centered and rooted in certain ideologies that protect the system and its institutions. And so, and at the center of that is education. That's one of the principal spaces that this ideology is grounded. And so when you're talking about the gap between the decolonial theory and praxis, we have to really, really be honest about understanding that decolonizing the curriculum means decolonizing knowledge, means disrupting all of the systems that are built on the false ideologies, right? The false ideologies, the knowledge, the hierarchies, the racial and gendered hierarchies and all of those interlocking oppressions that are sustained through our educational system. And so it's easy to talk about and theorize about it, but when you get into the point of trying to actually do that work, especially in academia, you run the risk of resistance because it is a challenging thing. For example, Dr. Matera entered by saying, let's acknowledge that we exist on stolen land. Children in PK through 12 are still being taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America. And all of those things are like the foundation of white supremacist ideologies that sustain capitalism and racism in America. So I think that I'm going to just say, I'll stop here and let someone else speak, but I think that that's the break. It's easy to theorize, but actually putting it to work, not just praxis in an academic or pedagogical sense, but actually decolonizing the curriculum into work is a challenge to the status quo of society itself. And so there's definitely resistance. There will be resistance to that.
I would add to that, it's not just a challenge to society, that's one element, but when you're talking about decolonizing the curriculum, we're also challenging basically traditional academia as well. And so when you think about even the structure of the tenure process, the hierarchy of assistant professor, and all those other, isms and titles and whatnot, and that entire process that people have to go through in order to achieve that. When we talk about decolonizing, that's creating space for us to really rethink, and challenge that entire system in general. And so there is going to be a lot of, I think, resistance to even doing so much of that, because people go through this process of obtaining the degree, they go through this process of achieving tenure, and then here comes somebody like me, I'm just gonna call you by your first name. We all got doctors here, so it doesn't even matter, right? Let's level the playing field. And some people may be resistant to even doing something like that. Or just think about how we practice learning in the classroom right now in general. We know that everybody has had to transition to this whole online remote learning. Little things that I ran into, because I have a program in the middle schools and high schools across the country, is that it's not so much even providing a computer to some of these students. Some of these students don't even have access to internet. And so when we talk about, creating space to decolonize academia, the dissemination of knowledge, how we as academics matriculate through the process, it really requires us to step back and rethink the entire system. And I think we are going to come up to some walls and some barriers and some challenges in order to do that, because there are some people that was how they got to where they are. And so they want to make sure everybody else has to deal with the same thing. And so I think, all of those factors play a part, but that's all I would add to it.
Yeah, definitely think it's important for us to re-examine the structures and right, simply decolonizing the curriculum isn't enough, because what happens when you're in an institution, right, that you decolonize the curriculum, but you don't have faculty member that students can relate to, or students can understand, or students can see as being someone that is like them, someone who is relatable, someone who's committed to their concerns, to their community. And so, changing curriculum, right, is an important step, but we also need to carry out structural change within institutions as well, if we want to really, truly transform academia.
I think there's a couple of things that we can do in the classroom that could be effective, because we do have some form of autonomy in that space as educators. And so for me, there's a couple of things. who I assign as required reading is so significant, because there's a certain kind of symbolic attachment to white male power. And so throughout my entire education, I was made to read dead white men's writings and nobody else's. I had to find my own way through and do my own extra work to educate myself on ideas beyond what I was getting. And that happened at all my levels of education, and started long before I was a university student. And so I think who we assign is really significant, because not only are you allowing students to learn different perspectives, but you're also sending the message that all types of people are able to create knowledge, and that is significant. I think also assigning readings beyond the academy is significant. So I'm teaching a class on music right now, crime resistance and song. And my students have to read lyrics from songs in the same way that they have to read a published article in a peer-reviewed journal. And that is significant because knowledge comes from art, and really art in so many ways articulates knowledge in the most brilliant, and the analysis that comes out of artistic voices is so much deeper. You know, it may be fewer words, but there's so many more ideas packed in a Tupac song, I think, than I will find in some straight up positivist pie chart citing boring criminology article, right? And so much of that knowledge that comes off as really kind of objective and research-based is not objective, and it's not based on research, it's based on the biases of criminology as a discipline. And so the way that we structure our syllabi in our classrooms, and the things that and the order in which students are exposed to information, I think is really important. I think the way that we set up our classrooms, when I'm in a classroom that allows me to move chairs, we move into a circular setting. And I talk to students about Foucault, and who stole a lot of Black people ideas, but that's a side conversation. But like the discipline of space and how significant it is for students to see each other's faces while I'm lecturing, so that it's not just my face and my voice that they see, but that they can see each other's reactions and engage with each other, even if silently, and to be able to look at each other instead of just having access to the back of each other's heads and then my face, and sort of like breaking down authority in the classroom in that way, while maintaining the boundaries of respect. Because Black women in the academy, we've seen all kinds of disrespect, and so striking that balance, I think, is important. And I'm not discounting the kind of backlash that we receive when we engage in this type of education. So there are risks that we take as we do that. But I think it's important for us in the classroom to practice as much as possible, even in terms of how we conduct the classroom, to practice as much as possible the decolonization that we are trying to teach people about. So emulate that in how we organize our spaces.
Yes to all of that, and then some. I would, when I think of this in my work, which is less in a classroom, more in these spaces outside of the classroom for students, and especially in the middle of a pandemic, I think about being okay with messiness, and not having to always stick to the structure. Again, things I'm always trying to learn and mostly unlearn in my work. But really understanding that to build collective power, to change institutions like the University of Arizona, to be respectful, welcoming, supportive of students from undocumented backgrounds, which it is far, far from at all, because they will often not even want to use the term undocumented. But to build any of that kind of collective power requires us to be messy in our design, and to be creative, right? In our shifts and our changes in policies. It also requires us, I think, to just kind of touching on what you all had talked about, just when and I think especially when you're thinking of the authors, right, who you're teaching, the scholars that you bring into the classroom for folks to read. I also think about our communities. There's obviously tons of knowledge within our local community that we tend to not necessarily disregard, although I would say some faculty do, but maybe just forget about. And I think we need to be more respectful and understanding of the knowledge that exists outside of our institution, because the predominantly populations outside of here are not attending our institutions. And so, and when I think of populations I work with that have undocumented status, there is tons of knowledge and wisdom there that will never enter the doors of the institution because we've never let them in, let alone even give people a chance to even apply most of the time. And so we have to deconstruct this idea of where our knowledge is coming from beyond the kind of articles, and think about the folks that we bring in to be our guest speakers or to bring that presentation and that knowledge to us. And I think in this moment, we're able to present on Zoom with each other. I think we see this real moment where we can already do that, right? We're kind of disrupting that space and our ability to share knowledge across the country, right? In spaces like this tonight. And so my last point would just be that, you know, in this very moment, I think we have to keep acknowledging that we're in a pandemic. And so when I think about assignments for students or the work that I ask students who work in our office to do, it is always with the place of care and self-care, that in the middle of a pandemic, I'm not expecting you to produce. I'm expecting you to stay healthy in the best ways that you know how, and to check in so that we can make sure we're all healthy together, right? It is not about this idea of production and pushing forward and creating program after program, which is what we're often forced to do as an institution just to survive, as we are, because we're on grant funding. And so we have to produce. That's what it feels like. But in moments like this, especially now, we have to stop and we have to pause and think about what's actually going on around us in a pandemic with 500,000 people who've died in the country. So I pause on that to just think about that space. This moment also has pushed me to a place of remembering why we're actually doing this work and where we're coming from, and how perfection and this individualistic idea of things in our classroom and our work on campus is not the way to go, but that we need to be looking out for each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with Dr. Matero's point that we need to foreground the voices of community members in classrooms. And I do that in my classes as far as introducing my students to my community-based research. And I found that to be empowering and emancipatory for my students, because many of them are from where I'm doing my research. And so for them to come into the classroom and feel that their community has a voice when it comes to criminology, when it comes to criminological issues, that's empowering. And they leave the class, I found, motivated to also want to engage in community research that helps to shift negative views and perceptions about their community. So yeah, it's definitely important to foreground the community. And I guess my next question is kind of, I see Dr. Z, you had your hand up. I didn't mean to rush past you.
No, because I wanted to comment on that too, because I think there's a misconception, and I loved Matt's point about the community. We gather our knowledge from the community. We come into academia and we go in the community and we all study what's happening in the community. So the knowledge is there. What we do is we take our education and we label it and we come up with these terms and then we publish it. And then we're like, oh yeah, we're the brilliant ones. But the reality of it is that if we don't acknowledge that, and that's a part of our own decolonial space, if we don't acknowledge that our knowledge especially in the social science, our knowledge comes directly from the community. The community shares their narratives, no matter, and we take their narratives and we either qualify it or quantify it or theorize it, and then we publish it and we get the credit for the knowledge. So in essence, I'm gonna just speak for myself. If we don't acknowledge the brilliance that exists in the spaces that we study, then we're also the same types of thieves as Columbus. And so we're also engaging in colonial and imperialist practices. And so I think sometimes we, before we can think about decolonizing anything on any level, we first have to decolonize ourselves and put ourselves on the level. I'm going to just call you Chanel. Chanel said, you know, we need to take off all of the hats and all of the dots and letters and all of this. And we have to recognize that we're humans. And as scientists, or as professors or as researchers, we are studying humans that are imparting their knowledge to us. And so just because we code it doesn't mean that it's our knowledge, right? So I think that's a part. And once we get to that point, we can begin to, as you were saying, Sean, I wanted to jump in, the work that you're doing with community-based. We don't have, when we research, we should be bringing the people that we have researched into the space to tell their own stories, right? You know, so we have to also be willing to acknowledge that there is knowledge in those spaces, that we don't own the knowledge, where we get the knowledge from, and then we have to pay homage to the people who supply the knowledge for us to get tenure, promotion, publications, and all of the other things that we see. So.
Can I share a quick example on this? When I was living in Nigeria and working with prisoners there, one of the things that I was also conducting research, but I really was there learning. And I was working with prisoners for a couple of years, and out of that came a book. And when it was time to publish the book, I gave all prisoners who were working with me the option to decide between publishing their own chapter in their own name, publishing their own chapter under a different name, or having me interview them. And every single person chose to publish a chapter in their own name. And when I made the proposal and published the book, a lot of my mentors in the academy told me not to do that. They said, this will look like an edited volume, and you wrote this book. And an edited volume doesn't have the same weight as a monograph. And so the best thing for you to do is to publish their chapters in the Journal of Prisoners on Prisons, and then to publish your book separately. And I ended up publishing their chapters in the JPP because I want other prisoners all over the world to have access to Nigerian prisoner experiences. But I ended up also publishing their chapters as standalone chapters in my book. And it didn't hurt me, and I was fine. Because if they wanted to count it as an edited volume, I had so many chapters that were mine, that were in it, that I already met the tenure standards. You know what I mean? And so I think that there's a lot of scare tactics that happen that we have to just learn to push back on. And that's what it was. Until now, there's this confusion. Like, is this an edited volume? Is this a monograph? And like, I refuse to define it because it is what it is. And if I am going to build a career through my work with prisoners, the very least I can do is make sure that their voices are represented in whatever way they feel is necessary.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree. And I think it's that scare tactic that you mentioned that really keeps a lot of scholars or academics in quote unquote a box here. And I think if we have more people like you or like Dr. Matt, Dr. Zoe, excuse me for saying Dr., but y'all know, who took that research and really used it and stepped outside of the box, we have more people to do that. What type of impact, would we as academics have on the entire world? And that's where I always go back. A lot of people who are traditional academics, they publish, they keep all of this stuff, like you got to pay for it, like I did. You publish it in these journals, all for tenure, but that's all focused on self. And I get so concerned about that too, because I take a quite different approach where most of my research, basically all of it, is to make an impact on the community, to build up the community, create better opportunities. But not only that, but as I continue to go forward, to reach back and pull people along with me who may not have had access or those types of opportunities. And so I just love your approach with that. And I just think, definitely more people should embrace, that strategy when they are writing, publishing, and doing different things. And then the other thing that I would say is in terms of, I think it was a comment you made about tangible actions that academics can do, people can do to decolonize the curriculum, specifically in the classroom. One of the things that we do at my university is we actually have this, which is a design, equity, and inclusion rubric. And so as we are building out courses, we look at everything. I'm looking at it right here. It has personal connections and relevance, adaptability of content, transparency of content, diversity of perspectives, diversity of media, diversity of reading materials. Like it goes on and on and on. It even has imagery and examples. And we have to we check it off to see like where our course actually falls. And I mean, and it ranges from absent or needs improvement all the way to exemplary. And I think that would at least start to move this needle of decolonization. If you had people to actually, as they're building out their courses, just take a look at this rubric and then check off, did I do this? Oh, let me see, all my examples are white men. I probably should change that because there may be some students in my class that can't relate to it. So I think that's important. And then the other thing that we've been doing is giving a diversity of assignments. So whereas some students are more visual and like to present, others may not like to be in front of a group of people presenting, well, they have the option. They can either present or they can write a paper. We're still assessing the same things. The outcomes are all the same. It's just a matter of how students retain and absorb that information and present it back is very different. So I think those are a couple of other things that I would add to what Dr. Vivian has said.
Thank you. So the next question, how do we not let decolonize the curriculum become a buzzword that gets watered down and colonized by elitists and careerists?
I can start if folks don't. I mean, decolonize as a term has already been taken and co-opted. And for me, I'm trying to think of the authors. I'm going to look them up and drop their names before we finish, because I read an article maybe last year, and I can't place the authors' names, but they talked about if you're not talking about the land, it's not decolonization, because at the root of it all is the theft of land, and land is life and water is life. And so if you're not actually doing work that returns the land to the people, then your work is something else. And so for them, gosh, why can't I pull their names out of my head right now? I will cite them properly before we finish, because I don't want to steal nobody's thoughts. But, and that makes me think, because we call so many things decolonizing. And I do think on some level, decolonizing our thoughts is important. And the process of decolonizing is necessary. But I think to avoid the pitfalls that these brilliant authors, whose names I can't pull right now, said, I try to also be really clear about as clear as possible about what I'm saying. So if we're talking about freedom dreams or freedom struggles, or we're talking about racism or slavery or heteropatriarchy, to be as specific as possible in our conversation, so that it doesn't become this sort of large, abstract, inaccessible process of decolonization, and to be really clear that without Indigenous power, there is no such thing as decolonization. Like at the root of decolonization here, in this region where we are, like in the United States, right, on Turtle Island, at the root of all that is Indigenous freedom. And so if we're not doing that and centering that in our struggles and conversations and teachings, then we aren't fully engaged, honestly, in decolonization.
I would just like to add, just call people out when they need to be called out, when they are trying to turn decolonization into a buzzword, or when they're trying to do something simply for their own career gain or their aspirations. And I'll just give you all a quick example. We know that there were demonstrations across the country all over the summer. And I had a colleague reach out to me and they said, hey, I want to do some qualitative research on Black women in academia and how they are, handling this along with the demonstrations and balancing all this stuff. And so I told the person, I said, well, I'll think about it. Send me the information, because it was supposed to be like a virtual interview or something like that. So I said, send me the information. So the person sends an abstract of the research, the consent form where you sign it off. And I looked, and the first name on it was a name. And so I researched the name of the first person on the study, right? Because, people put themselves in order. And lo and behold, it was a white man. And so I'm sitting here like, how are you collaborating with somebody to research Black women, and you're a Black woman, but you're like third on the name of on the list of the researchers who are conducting the study? So I nicely reached out to this person and I said, what is your involvement in this study, and how'd you get to know, who is this person, the first author? I said, who is this person? They said, well, they're the person conducting the study. And so I'm like, well, how did you get involved? And they said, well, they just asked me to jump on board. And this was on intersectionality. So then I go and say, well, what research, what authors on intersectionality are you going to be using, in your research, in your lit review? And so, I'm thinking they're going to name somebody like, I don't know, Kimberly Crenshaw, or, maybe even a Hillary Potter or somebody like that. And she starts naming some people that I have never even heard of. So, then I'm like, okay, I can't participate in this study because, number one, it's not authentic. Y'all are capitalizing on this moment that we have right here, and you're just trying to gather a bunch of Black women to use them as your quote unquote subjects in this study. And it's only to help out this white man who's the number one author on this. So I was like, I'm not going to do it. And I think, sometimes when we talk about decolonization, we just have to take bold moves and call people out on things like that.
I just want to jump in because I found the citation, and yes to all of that, Dr. Chanel Jones. So much co-optation happening. It's actually what it is colonization. They're colonizing intersectionality and Black feminism. So that's what they're doing. The article I was trying to cite earlier is called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And it was published in 2012 by Tuck and Yang. Mm-hmm. And it is open access. So if you just type in decolonization is not a metaphor, you will find it.
So we don't have to pay for it, great.
Which is a colonizing process.
Dr. Chanel Jones, I appreciate what you were saying. I think I've appreciated this conversation so much. I think when I hear what you're talking about with that white man as the first author, I just continue to resonate with myself as a white man of the need to move out of the way and the need to move back. And I think it's in my time and in my work, I have definitely learned that lesson the hard way. When you don't move out of the way, when things get centered around you, and when you become the face of things, as I've been before and called the face of an organization that works with undocumented students, and that is trying to push through that and to ensure that folks are not seeing that, required too many mistakes in my part, but also just constantly pushing folks to remember who's actually at the forefront of this work and who is actually risking their lives often in a place like Arizona that is so anti-immigrant and xenophobic and violent towards immigrant populations that it's that we need to recenter what we do. And so that's required so much unlearning. So I guess I'm saying this to white folks who are on this conversation. We need to move out of the way, and that we need to be listening to our folks of color and to our Black Indigenous scholars and community leaders, and taking the lead and then really doing the work, and then working with each other in order to kind of move this conversation and to move the work. We have to be engaging with each other as white folks to really kind of recenter the importance of where this knowledge is coming from that we're working with. And to go back to your question, Sean, I think about, to stop things from getting watered down, we have to just continue to call it out. I echo that that Dr. Vivian talked about, that it's a constant need to, when in spaces, to ensure and think about who's in the room and who's not, pausing those conversations to ensure that the folks who need to be in the room, who might be being talked about at that point, as we see all the time at the university where undocumented students or DACA students are being talked about. If they're not in the room to fight for themselves, to share their own perspectives, then that conversation really is not truly about them. It's about doing something to them that's likely going to be violence from the institution because it's not well thought through, and it still remains a colonizing way to do it.
I wanted to say for me personally, and in particular, a part of not allowing the reality of decolonization to be watered down is really understanding what colonialism and imperialism actually is globally. And that extends far beyond the United States. It's about the extraction of resources and the extraction of human bodies and the extraction of labor for the purpose of ruling class gain. So that's my theoretical perspective. And Vivian, I'm going to resurrect the dead white theorists because we use them. I think one of the important things for me in my work with my students in particular is being able to take the theory and make the theory applicable to understanding the problems and conditions and history of marginalized people. And so for me in the classroom, Paulo Freire's work, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Bell Hook's work, Teaching to Transgress, Teaching for Hope, are my blueprints of decolonizing my own curriculum in my space, my chosen space at an HBCU, because you have to be able to prepare scholars to do the work of continuing the decolonization. And so in my work and in my professorship, my education, my facilitation in my classroom, the one thing that I reject is the banking model of education, where I'm the authority and I'm spitting knowledge and I test and then you regurgitate what I said. I tell my students all the time, how I teach you comes from my subjective lens, no matter how much I think I know. And every professor teaches no matter what their knowledge from their subjective lens. And so it's important for you to be able to take agency over your own process, over your own understanding, over your own analysis and your own knowledge. And so I think for me, I use sociology as the catalyst to develop critical and analytic thinking and abstract reasoning, using diverse pedagogical methods. I love what you said, Vivian. I don't use traditional textbooks. I don't use traditional rubrics. I don't use traditional pedagogical approaches in the classroom, because a part of decolonizing the curriculum means helping our students to be independent and critical thinkers who develop their own frames of reference and analyses, and then begin to challenge, do the work of challenging the systems, both in an intellectual sense and also in an activist space. And so I think that for me is probably one of the most important ways that we can ensure that the term decolonization doesn't just become a catchphrase and you actually implement decolonizing as a staunch praxis in both your teaching and also your research and your service as well.
Yes, I agree. That was powerful. So we're at 8:30. I'm going to open it up to Q&A because I see we have a couple of questions that were asked by attendees. So if you have a question for us, now is the time to enter your question in the Q&A.
And also, Sean, if anybody would like to ask a question, they could raise their hand and I'll open their microphone.
Thank you.
The first question we have is referencing Dr. Jones' point about access to research knowledge. How do we make the case to university leadership that open access journals are valid? At this point, they don't have the same weight/impact factor as the journals with a paywall, which of course impacts tenure/promotion.
Yeah, I think that requires a bigger conversation, and it really depends on the culture of your institution, right? So at my institution, we really don't put much weight on, at least like traditional schools, on the different journals and everything. You know, we look at the body of work, and we have varying definitions for even what scholarship and service, you know, is, and teaching as well. And so I think it just depends on that lens from which your university is looking, but also to be willing and open to perhaps challenge and or question, hey, you know, why do we, you know, not have open access journals? Could we explore that? Maybe taking it to faculty senate, getting a couple of people, a couple of faculty involved in that conversation, seeing how many people would be on board with that, and then moving it up the pipeline. But it really is one of those things where I think if faculty would galvanize together and organize and, you know, say, hey, this is what we would like to see, or we would like to change, you know, how these journals are ranked for the tenure process and whatnot. I think that way you can get some traction on it. I always say, you know, I'm very lucky where I'm at, where, you know, I can take, like, I organized a whole, well, actually 3 different, like, you know, demonstrations this Sunday. They counted that as scholarship. And so, you know, so I think it just depends on where you are. And that's the other part of decolonizing academia. You know, I get, you know, people need to make a living, but at the same time, when you're choosing the institution for which you want to be employed, you might want to look at how they rank those things, what they consider scholarship, what they consider teaching, what they consider service. And if that doesn't align with your values and which you want to do, then you may want to look somewhere else, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you position yourself to enjoy what you're doing, and that you don't become quote unquote, I don't want to say, but I mean, basically a slave to academia, where you just find yourself producing articles and research, and you're conducting research for the sake of conducting research. You know, I'm, like I said previously, I'm big on impact. And so, you know, I'm at a university that basically I am aligned to make a greater impact specifically in my community. That's what I do. That's what everybody knows that I do. And I love what I do. And so I think, you know, being intentional about where people are applying for these positions, where you are seeking tenure at these positions, I think all of that matters. So I hope I answered the question.
I think also there's an argument to be made for becoming obsolete. And I think institutions, the language, having chaired my department all these years, I've like been at the table and listened to things that are behind the scenes kind of shocking. And what I've learned is that universities understand fully that they cannot afford to become obsolete. And so part of not being obsolete includes engaging in more open forums of dialogue. And it's like in this era of like social media and now Zoom, post-pandemic life is not going to be like it was before. So more access and more digital access is something that universities must consider if they plan not to become obsolete. So I do think like engaging with the institution on that level, like beyond just I would like to publish in these places, but to kind of always bring in that bigger picture, is part of the decolonizing process of like reminding the university that it is there to serve. It is a service-based institution. Particularly public universities should be engaging in open scholarship. And so always tying it into, I think, the larger picture of freedom and liberation and access might help. And also not to be alone. To the person who asked the question, like not to let yourself get through this by yourself alone, always reach out. And get as much support as you can. If it's not happening internal to your department or university, go to those conferences where folks can network and build around you so that you're not fighting this on your own.
Thank you. The next question is, for clarity of context, please define / describe, and then in quotes, the unquote, colonized academic curriculum, i.e. its tenets, from the perspective of U.S. institutions. If you want to read that again, it's in the Q&A, everybody.
A colonized curriculum is one that pushes the perspectives of the colonizers. And so that's to keep it as simple as possible, right? And so any kind of perspectives that forces down upon us the perspectives of slave owners and colonizers is a colonizing curriculum. It is perpetuating the assumptions of historically violent institutions and their agents. And I would remind us always to remember Aimé Césaire's discourse on colonialism and his most important point, which is that colonization decivilizes the colonizer. And so if we are working towards an anti-colonial society, we are at the same time working towards an elevated quality of life. And so if the perspectives that you are learning or teaching do not move us towards freedom and a higher quality of life, it is a colonizing curriculum.
And for me, understanding from a theoretical perspective, understanding the impact of education and academia is important. So when you're talking about global capitalism, when you're talking about patriarchy, when you're talking about white supremacy as ideologies, not just systems, but ideologies that are embedded into the systems, what we argue is that then the systems are embedded into the institutions. And the goal of the systems and institutions is to protect the status quo. So if you are in a country that embodies capitalism or embodies patriarchy or embodies white supremacy as the ideologies, the fundamental ideologies that move the system, then those ideologies are going to be embedded in the institutions. And that becomes a part of the colonial space, right? So we're not divorcing. Well, for me, I don't divorce decolonizing curriculum from the whole concept of what colonialism is. Colonialism is the active act of separating people and alienating people from their land, from their resources, from their agency, from their productive and reproductive labor. And so the system of education, if it's designed to promote conformity to society, is also going to embody that. So what we look at is the ways in which those ideologies are embedded into an educational and an academic space, and how they're transferred through the transmission of knowledge. I go to college, I get the knowledge, I become a professor, I transfer the knowledge to my student. So the act of decolonizing the curriculum or decolonizing education means that you begin to critique and deconstruct the ways in which colonial ideologies are embedded, and you resist them as both a pedagogy and a praxis in your space. That's what decolonizing the curriculum means.
I'll just add one more thing because that was brilliant. So I would just add my little spin on it from my perspective as well, is everything that Dr. Vivian said, everything that Dr. Zoe said, but I also look at it in terms of how we are actually preparing our students to graduate and what the degree actually means in its totality. And what I mean for that is when we colonize academia, the goal is you go through 4 years, you get the degree. The degree then signifies that you have completed a set curriculum, a body of knowledge, and that is your trophy, your accomplishment for what you have done. I would add to everything that they would say is that when we decolonize curriculum, we are also actually breaking up that process, and we are affording students the opportunity to create or to achieve what I like to call micro credentials and or badges along the process to signify the accumulation and the acquisition of knowledge along the way, so that they don't have to wait 4 years to be certified by a degree, but they can demonstrate the knowledge that they have acquired along the way through these micro credentials and these certifications and these badges. And so I think that is another element that I would add on to decolonizing curriculum.
And sis, can I jump in on piggyback on what you just said? I'm so sorry because that was dope. I think also too is to also place the badges and the status that we associate with validity as mere symbols, and to also give people the space to be able to express their knowledge in their own way and validate it without the badges. Listen, I'm from the hood. I'm just got to do it one time. I am from the hood. And the greatest lessons I've learned are from people that did not have a degree and did not have a high school education. And when we get to the point where we become so arrogant that we require people to have the badges in order to validate their knowledge, then we all lose. And so liberation, true liberation and true decolonization means removing all of the badges and all of the systems and all of the things that society has created for us to validate our knowledge, and allowing people to just be creative and brilliant in their own spaces. So I had to tag team Chanel.
I love it. That was great. Yes, I completely agree.
Can I add one thing to that, please? Because this is so inspiring, but what you have me thinking about, both Dr. Chanel and Dr. Z, the role of the university for so long has been to institutionalize knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that we are able to get in here and to flip some of that stuff around, right, is so significant, because in order to decolonize the curriculum, we have to deinstitutionalize knowledge. And having access to doing that is such an important part of our freedom struggles. And so I'm just so inspired to be on this panel with you all, but to also begin to think about like the roles that we play and how deinstitutionalizing knowledge includes always highlighting what our communities and our ancestors and what freedom fighters have been saying outside of the institution for so long.
And I would add that a decolonized curriculum, right, should be student-centered. It should focus on the needs and demands of students, and especially at minority serving institutions. I mean, a lot of institutions, student demographics are changing, and we really haven't seen the institutional shifts, right, to support those students' needs. And so I think it's extremely important that academics listen to their students, because far too often we think we know what students want, and that isn't the case.
Thank you. We have an attendee with their hand raised. Cynthia, go ahead and unmute your microphone and please ask your question. Go ahead, Cynthia. You need to unmute your microphone and then you can ask your question. Okay, well, we'll get back to Cynthia. The next question is directed for results from the web. Dr. Jones. Would you be willing to share the rubric mentioned on constructing syllabi?
Yeah, where should I share it?
Maybe you could send it to Sean and he could share it with the community.
Absolutely, yeah, I can do that.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, we'll go back to the next question. When you have community leaders and others speak in your classes, do you compensate them for their time? Do you think that is something that we should do?
Yes and yes. When you can, right? I mean, there's always going to be some funds that you can find at the university, but definitely a university's role in its surrounding communities should be to share its resources. And so particularly when folks are coming from surrounding communities, the university should compensate them for their time. And beyond that, like thank them and compensate them above and beyond the time they spent there, but to actually give someone a proper honorarium, whether or not they hold a PhD, because you do that for guest speakers and others. So I think that we do and we should.
I wholeheartedly agree. If somebody is going to take time out of their day and use their time, effort, and energy to come and speak to a class, they should definitely be compensated with some form of honorarium. And if the university, for whatever reason, doesn't approve an honorarium, that would make me question the university. But then think it's definitely incumbent upon us as, the instructors or professors of the course to then compensate them ourselves. But they should definitely be regardless compensated. I wholeheartedly agree with you, Dr. Vivian.
Same, yes and yes. I would say two things come to mind. One, there's numerous folks who don't know what their knowledge and what they're presenting is worth in comparison to what other speakers are coming in with, and knowing what their honorarium is and what their hourly rates are. So for those folks, I try to show what other people charge or what other people have paid, and to make sure that we're doing this in an equitable way for them. Because there's been numerous times where we've had students say, well, it's just, I don't know, like $20 or $50. And I'm like, no, what you're producing and what you're sharing with us and spending our time is worth a whole lot more than that. And worth more than we can actually ever really pay for folks, right? But to make sure that we're at least doing it equitably. And the second thing I would say is challenge your institution's policies in terms of who can be paid for their work. So we have numerous issues all the time of being able to pay folks who don't have an immigration status. Find ways around it. You have to find ways and connect with organizations outside the institution to ensure that regardless of immigration status, people are getting paid for their labor.
Mhm.
Well, shit. I know that there are some people on the call that I invite to my class all the time. Sorry, y'all, Lorraine, Paul. I think I think I agree. I agree that the answer is yes and yes. However, I have another side to that, because in my work and in my space, one, I don't, and I think we all should, like, you go to the hairdresser, you get your hair done, you pay. And so it's like you get paid for the manual labor, but intellectual labor is a different thing. And I think, Matt, when you talked about the value of intellectual labor, people don't put a value on that. But then I also think that the imparting of knowledge from a metaphysical perspective, where being is important and purpose is important and meaning is important for me. If I got paid for everything that I've done, and I'm sure y'all too, every thing that I've done, every speech for free, then I would probably be a millionaire. So I think that people should get paid, but equally, I think that that we, in a sense, and they didn't ask that question, but I think we, in a sense, kind of owe to pay back the blessing that we were given at the same time too. So I'm thinking more from my perspective than paying other people. And I thank and love the people who come to my class and just do it just because. I love y'all. I'll pay y'all in love.
Thank you.
I do just want to say that it's important not to limit who can come and speak if we can't raise the funds, right? And so I see that perspective, Dr. Zoe, and so thank you for bringing it up.
Now, I'm just going to add that, many of our institutions have resources. So I think it's important for us to tap into those resources to give back to the community, to have the community come in and share their knowledge. Because far too often, we're so focused on bringing in scholars, right, which is important. But like Dr. Zeke mentioned, the true theorists, the people with all of the knowledge, aren't people with PhDs, right? They're people who are incarcerated, or people who haven't had access to the opportunities that many of us have. And so I think it's important for us to always focus on using our institutions as a way to give back to community.
Thank you. Next question. Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives here. I'm curious if you have all felt pressure to always do more. For example, to make sure your students know how to navigate the system as it is, while also preparing them for changing, dismantling it. In addition to also personally navigate the system as it is, while working to dismantle it, ? If you do feel this kind of pressure, how do you navigate it? If you don't, what do you think it is about your experience or life that provides you the space to do the kind of work you want to do?
Can I go first on that? That's a dope question. Um, you know what? And that's a dope question. And the fact that whoever asked it, you're probably dope in and of yourself. And so for me, I am a Black woman from Berry Farms Projects, and I have several interlocking oppressions under my belt. And so my struggle um, prepared me for what I consider a divine purpose. I consider myself an activist before I consider myself a professor. And so my classroom is kind of like my activist space. And when you when you approach academia from a divine perspective, whatever that means for you, then the work is easy. Yes, you do have to do a lot. My students, it's crazy, but most of my students have my cell phone number. It's not just about me teaching sociology, it's about me nourishing, I call it watering, or putting water on them to nourish their evolution and their actualization. And then with the expectation that they give back. And so for me, it's not a tiring process, but it's very rewarding, because then I get to see my babies go out and then give back and then give back and then give back. And so it's also a way of establishing your legacy when your body is gone. The legacy that you leave through your students, even if they never mention your name, the legacy that you leave through your students becomes your motivation. And so for me, education, higher education, period, should be driven from a divine purpose space and not just from a professional space. And when it is, then your job becomes easy. And the work that you have to do to nourish the students become easy.
I completely, wholeheartedly agree. I would say the same thing. I don't feel pressure at my job. I do a lot. Sean read my entire bio. And the crazy thing is, I do so much more than actually what he read. And it really, people don't put it into his perspective. Like when he was reading, I was like, oh, this is a lot. But when I'm actually doing it, it doesn't feel like it, because it all goes back to what I keep mentioning is impact. And I like what Dr. Z said about building a legacy. What I feel like my purpose here is to impact community, and to help bring up a generation of change agents. And that's what I strive to do. And so it requires me, dealing with a lot of different entities, organizations, sitting on multiple boards, doing a lot of work. But it doesn't feel like that, because at the end of the day, the goal is here is to make an impact and to ultimately just turn the whole criminal justice system upside down. And so, I think when you find what you love and when you marry that passion and purpose together, the walk becomes so much easier, and it doesn't feel like a heavy burden or a weight. And I always go and say, if I didn't make a dime for what I do, I would still do it because I love it so much. And my prayer is that everybody finds their passion, so that when they do the work, it really doesn't even feel like work at that point. And so I completely agree with Dr. Z on that one.
I think the only thing that I would add to brilliant advice and feedback from Dr. Z and Dr. Jones is that when it starts to feel like a burden, it's time to do something else. It's time to step back and to have somebody else do what you can no longer do. And so knowing when you've taken on something that you don't need to take on, or knowing when you are done doing something is really important. And then stepping away so that that thing that you're working on, you've done what you can for it, and someone else needs to be able to take it in whatever direction it needs to go. And so that balance, I think, is really important.
Okay, I see that Dr. Spencer would like to answer this next question. The question is, I'm an Indigenous doctoral student. For someone who has extremely limited representation within academia, what kind of advice do you have to maneuver such a colonized system while at the same time not being tokenized?
Let me go back because Matt was about to say something. And so I am going to defer to Matt. I don't think you saw him. So I'm going to defer to Matt. And then I'm also going to defer to them on that question too, because I was about to type something and I didn't realize I couldn't type it. So sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
Thanks, Dr. Z. All I was going to say was, you know, I'm a white cis het man who is has tons of privilege, and so if I do not reflect on that and pause and think about that in my work, it's then I fail all the time. And because I think of this last part of the question from Sarah's question, and in terms of that experience, those privileges have opened the doors for me in much easier ways than my colleagues in our BIPOC communities. And I think it's even the work of our center at a university or the work of a nonprofit that I've been part of, it's folks have listened because they've seen me in those identities and been more willing to listen. And the problem there is that we're building, you end up building some solutions on kind of like quicksand, right? That it's just going to get washed around sand, that it just gets washed away by the waters because we're not centering, we're not decolonizing sometimes. In my experience, when I was not thinking about how I, as a colonizer, was taking too much of the forefront or being too much of the forefront and taking too much of the lead, then it becomes problematic and you build something that's not sustainable. And so it is thinking about that space, and when working with students who are white students, ensuring that we're having those dialogues, that conversation about their place in all of this work. When we're thinking about the conversations with students who are coming from undocumented backgrounds and who are students of color or Black students, it's ensuring that we're also centering care. And that we're not just saying you have to do all of these things, that you need to navigate the system and you have to change the entire system, but it's ensuring that we're not burning folks out in that. And that takes a lot of reflection. So anything that we're doing in this praxis without any type of reflection, right, as Paulo Ferretti talks about, then we fail because we just keep moving forward and not pausing to understand what our work actually means. Am I turning it back to you, Dr. Z? I feel like you asked me to answer that other question. Okay, it's back to me. Remind me what that question was again?
The question was, I'm an Indigenous doctoral student. For someone who has extremely limited representation within academia, what kind of advice do you have to maneuver such a colonized system while at the same time not being tokenized?
Yeah, I would just say that it's important for you to find your support system, because there are people out there who are supportive, who have been through the struggle and who are willing to provide you with insight and mentorship and guidance. And so that's important to find your support system. But also it's important for marginalized folks to realize we belong in these spaces, right? These spaces are for us. And so I just always embrace knowing that I belong, no matter what space I'm in. I know I belong to be there. My ancestors, my family have fought hard for me to have these opportunities. And so that's just something I'm mindful of, and that it's my duty to go into these spaces with confidence and to navigate these spaces with confidence, knowing that I have the ability to shine. And my seat at the table is important. So I serve an important role in trying to improve representation and motivating students from marginalized backgrounds, whether they're students of color, students from the LGBTQ community, or even poor white students. So it's important for students to see people like us. So I would use that as motivation, knowing that you're needed. And I think that will assist you throughout your journey.
I just also want to add that it's so important, and I wish someone had said this to me when I was a grad student, so I'm going to now say it out loud. It's so important for your university to fund your ability to go to conferences that are centered on Indigenous studies and that are run by Indigenous people, because you need to be able to have that outlet and to meet other students and professors, Indigenous professors who have been in grad school, who can give you that firsthand kind of advice. And the university must fund this. Like they need, if they are going to tokenize, which they will, because they need to have this like diversity to be relevant. They need the diversity so that their white students know how to interact with us so they can be more successful when they enter the workplace. Like they need us. And to always remember that, and to make some demands regarding, like, if you're gonna have me stay here in this institution and not accept anyone else who's Indigenous while I'm here, the least that you can do is fund me to go to a conference to meet folks so that I can thrive. And to not be afraid of those demands, because I don't wanna cuss, they owe you this, is what I wanna say. Sorry, I have a problem.
Me too.
Sometimes.
I think we all do.
Can I just jump in really quickly? I would encourage you to be fearless and unapologetic in who you are. I always tell my students, and I'm at an HBCU, and so I'm an ally to the Indigenous experience, but I recognize that it is not my experience. But one of the things that I tell my students is that there's a quote by Marcus Garvey. He says, "A man without knowledge of self is like a tree without roots." And I think that when you talk about the colonial curriculum and the way that the colonial curriculum has erased the experience of Indigenous people, because you are an Indigenous person, you have a story to tell. And the story to tell in whatever your from your perspective and where you are is valuable, to your institution. I would encourage you to be a fighter. I would encourage you to be a resistor. I would encourage you to be fearless and unapologetic in who you are. I would encourage you to put boundaries around yourself so that you don't allow people to exploit you, while simultaneously being fearless in correcting the things that need to be correcting and seeking the support that you need to seek to be whole. And then most importantly, engaging in that self-care and finding that support network to make sure that you're supported in your resistance. But I tell you, be fearless and be unapologetic about who you are and disrupt the system that you're in.
I also want to give, I want to offer myself, if you want to contact me after this panel, there is the Center of Indigigogy. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. And it is an Indigenous run graduate program. It is Indigenous professors. And I think right now they have an all Indigenous cohort, their first all Indigenous cohort. And the way that this center, we want to talk about decolonizing the curriculum. This center is doing the most amazing work. And so please, the person's name who asked the question, I'm trying to find it in the, I don't want to say their name out loud, but I'm looking in the Q&A. You can contact me. You can find my email address at the UMass Dartmouth website, and I would be happy to connect you with folks at this center so that you have direct contact as soon as possible.
Sean, there are 2 more entries in the Q&A.
Okay.
The first one is actually a comment. I retired 10 years ago after teaching for 40 years in sociology at John Jay College. Your voices and positions make me feel so proud to have taught people like you, and hopeful because there is so much development, awareness, and challenge that you bring to the academic and public arena. Your openness and challenge for and with your students and centering their history and lives is right on target. Thank you, and your students are very lucky to have you. And the final question is, how do you all maintain your sense of focus and drive in the face of resistance to decolonization? The colonizers try so hard to determine this work. You're also optimistic and hopeful, and thank you. But how do you take care of yourselves in all this important work?
Well, I'll give you a quick story of a situation that I had to deal with this summer. So I mentioned earlier that I had organized a couple of demonstrations, and one of those was a Black Women's March where we had 3,000 women, Black women, gather in downtown Columbus and march and advocate of Black lives and all that. And then I had to do a bunch of different interviews and whatnot about police brutality, anti-racism, racism, structural oppression that Black people are dealing with regularly since then. And so I will never, and mind you, that was all in the midst of a global pandemic, right? So I will never forget, I received an email from a colleague at work. We will call this person a Karen. And in the email, it started off so nice because this is how it works. Oh, I just, love the work that you are doing. And I just feel like, you're just doing a great job, yada, yada, yada. But one of the things that I have noticed is that your spark that you usually have is a little diminished, and your disposition in some of our meetings have changed, and I really just want you to get that spark back. And I know that this work that you're doing, you've probably received criticism and people have probably given you negative comments, but I just want to encourage you, that you need to get that spark back, and I'd be more than happy to help you, yada, yada, yada. So, I mean, this was like a one-off email. So I'm just like, what? Like, where did this come from, And so I paused because my first inclination was to respond to that with all kinds of four-letter words. But then I'm like, all right, let me pause and let me think about this for a moment. And then I responded. And my response to her was simply this. In times like these, what we ought to be doing is giving grace. And I nicely said, I actually haven't received any type of negative feedback or anything for any of the work I'm doing, because this is what I built my career off of. I've been doing this for such a long time. But then I also mentioned, I said, but maybe that spark that you're talking about is because I had COVID over the summer. I was like, it might be because I had COVID and literally couldn't breathe when we were in a meeting. And so when I tell you, I sent that email and I called her out. I said, instead of jumping to conclusion, maybe you should perhaps lead with a question. And then ultimately in this day and age, like I said, I give grace because you don't know what people are dealing with. And it was so interesting that she automatically attached me to being negative and my attitude changing and all of that, because it was in the height of the Black Lives Matter demonstration. But she didn't even realize and stop to pause. Oh, we're in a pandemic. Maybe Chanel actually caught COVID and she hadn't been feeling well, And so that was actually what the situation was. And I think oftentimes when we get into these spaces, and I nicely sent her an email, I CC'd a couple of people and called her out on it. And she completely changed her approach in her response and now in all of her interactions with me. And I think sometimes this work is great, but when we come up with things like that, I just err on the side of call it out, address it head on, be unapologetic in your approach, and then move on from it. And so that's how I dealt with that situation and other ones in the past.
I'll go really quickly. Like Chanel, the work to be done for like true liberation takes me outside of the classroom. And I will admit that probably, I can be considered a controversial figure even at an HBCU, because the HBCUs are also colonial institutions. And sometimes patriarchy takes the place of white supremacy in the exact same oppressive way. And so the term that I'll use, like I told the person before about being unapologetic and about the divine purpose, like it gets tiring. Like it gets tiring, the collective work to be done, as a whole. And I'm not really good at doing self-care, but again, because I believe it to be a divine purpose, the one thing that I've learned, and I'm going to just go spiritual for a second because it's the end and I can. The one thing that I've learned is that when you are divinely instructed to do something, what you need will always be provided for you, and you will always find rest. And the reward may not be money, but the reward will come as a result of you living and doing your divine purpose. And so for me, I think being able to see the changes, however small they are, that we make in society through the work that we do, be it a student leading and organizing a protest. I had several who did work. I broke my leg in a car accident, and I guess my Most High knew to do it right in the heat of the movement. So I couldn't even go outside. And just to see the work that my students were doing outside was absolutely magnificent to me, because it showed me that I don't have to be there, and that, you know, the legacy lives on. So I think that for real, it's rough when you're actually doing the work, but if you believe it to be your divine purpose, just know that you'll always be provided for and find comfort in that, even when it gets hard, because you will take hits. Like, you, if you do the work for real, you're gonna take hits, but know that you will be protected and provided for in the work if your work is righteous and liberatory work.
Yeah, I actually find doing the work to be therapeutic. And actually today, like I engaged in some field work with formerly incarcerated persons, and I was just like amazed at my energy after spending time with them today. And so when, you know, I face detractors or haters or people who are trying to deter me from accomplishing my goals, I always just focus on doing the work. And that seems to put me in a positive space where I'm able to be effective as far as my advocacy, research, and service. So I just always commit myself to doing the work whenever I face issues.
I think also knowing what your fuel is. My fuel is the ocean. Okay, I know that if I can see the ocean and I can give myself a chance to really just breathe in that salt air, it does something for me. And so if you can figure out for yourself what your fuel is and allow yourself the time to get that when you need it, it does make a difference. And we live in a world where you actually have to schedule that time in, and I have had to do that. You know, I haven't done it recently, to be completely honest. So I'm like not practicing what I preach, but just knowing what you need and making the time to provide that for yourself is such a significant part, because colonization actually takes away what we need. And so if you're so caught up in the work that you're not taking care of your own needs, then you have colonized yourself. The work has colonized you. And so don't let that happen, because so many of us, particularly if you're female or femme, you are going to be in that nurturing role all the time, and you seldom get that back. And so we must do for ourselves. And I think our students in particular need to see us do that for ourselves. They need to see us, particularly as women or femme folks, that we are not going to just be your maids and your nurturers, but we need to set those examples, if not even just for our own self, but even as educators. I think it's so significant to make sure that we are okay along the way.
I would just add, listen to my co-presenters. And for me, find a therapist, make sure you are checking in and whatever therapy might look for lots of folks looks really different. There's a quote I had just recently seen in an Instagram post, actually, that I've just written down constantly in the last few weeks, that is from Dr. Thema, that says, spend less time reacting and more time creating. Build more of what you want to see. And it's hard within our institutions when there's pressures that make you have to react to certain things. But if we find that time, if we find the ocean, which is also a spot for me too, which I live in a very landlocked state of Arizona. But I have to find water in some ways. I have to find greenery around me in some ways, because that's part of the healing nature of our land. And then the last thing I would say is boundaries. Set your boundaries. Think about, you know, what is it that, and I struggle with this too. It sounds like folks are also struggling with this too, that, you know, we moved into this time of everything being online, and it feels like meetings that they can just start whenever and end whenever now. It's like folks just start work and we're like, yeah, let's meet at 7 a.m. It seems like that's what works for everyone. And I'm like, I had to even say to my partner the other day, what time did we usually go to work? Because it feels like the norm is literally 7 o'clock, that this is just like things will just start. And I'm like, this is not okay. So it's reminding ourselves like what our boundaries are to take care of ourselves in that process. And, you know, I'm doing reading and rereading of Charlene Carruthers' book of Unapologetic, a Black queer feminist mandate for radical movements. And she leaves me with these thoughts all the time of asking yourselves the 5 questions of who are you, or who am I, who are my people, what do you want, what are we trying to build, and are we ready to win? And I feel like it's, we have to keep finding our people that are gonna challenge all of those pieces and set those boundaries with us. And so I think that's a key piece of this, in the idea of doing something in a collective, right? Because that's part of the decolonizing approach to our work.
Is that it for the questions?
Yes, Sean, that we've answered all of them that were in the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you, Pete. Yeah, thank you, panelists, for this amazing conversation. I really appreciate you joining us tonight and sharing your knowledge. Thank you for everybody who joined us tonight to watch this important conversation. And I also want to thank Pete and Brian from IRT here at William Patterson for assisting with the technical support. You guys are always phenomenal with your expertise and your service. So thank you. So for everybody who's interested in getting the video to this event, you can contact me at wilsons47 at wpunj.edu, wilsons47 at wpunj.edu, or you can find me on Twitter, Dr. Sean K. Wilson. On Twitter, Dr. Sean K. Wilson, or you can just go to the William Patterson University Sociology and Criminal Justice webpage to find my faculty profile, and you can contact me that way. And I know there were some people who were interested in some of the resources that Dr. Jones mentioned, so I can share those with you as well if you reach out to me. So again, thank you, everybody. This was amazing conversation, and perhaps we can do it again in the future, but thank you, everybody.
I just want to say thank you to Dr. Wilson for organizing this. Everybody has been thanked, and we need to thank you first and foremost, because you did do the work and pull this together. And so thank you. I mean, I don't speak of, I would like everybody to say thank you.
Speak for me. Yes, you're speaking for me as well. I took it off. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for having us. And thank you all. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed it as well. Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for creating this space. This was awesome.
Thank you. It was an honor.
I appreciate it.
You all have a great night and take care. And let's continue to do the work, right?